I think I understand your point. Your point is, why don't I, for example, say frequently gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, or why don't I use what you described as an umbrella term, although, again, you didn't...
No, I'm not suggesting it is an umbrella term.
Exactly. So to answer your question...
including the umbrella of people who are...
I understood the question, and it's a fair question, and I understand it. The answer to the question is, on the narrowest terms, because there is no umbrella term. So to say, why don't you use the umbrella term when you don't have one, or when we don't have one, it kind of it suggests to the speaker that they should do something that no one has actually come up with the actual easy way to do. But please, could I please finish answering your question?
Forget the umbrella term.
And that's where I'm going.
Why you're not including the entire...
This is the third time you've stated the question, and I totally understood it, and I am trying to answer it. Okay? I'm giving a rounded answer to the question you asked. The core of the question you're asking is, why don't I say gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, or as you put forward the names of everything and every time? And I was giving the narrow answers because, as a narrow matter, it's very difficult to do, and no one has come up with the actual way to do it. But the more important point that I think responds, whether you agree with me or not, to what you're asking, is that if you actually think back to what I've said, and you can go back to this tape as well, you also didn't hear me say some other things that a lot of people say. For example, gay marriage. The one time I used the phrase gay marriage, I put it in quotes, like that. You didn't hear me say same-sex marriage. You didn't hear me use any of those terms that people often use, and there's a reason for that. And that is because, whether you agree with this or not, to me this is actually not just about, or even primarily about, identity stripes or categories of people. This is about something bigger than that. I don't think we should use terms like gay marriage or same-sex marriage, because we're not talking about that. We're talking about marriage. We're talking about exclusion from something that rightly belongs to everybody. And the question is, what reason does the government have, what reason does society have from excluding any group of people based on sex or sexual orientation as based on race, religion, or other? So if you think back to the whole set of comments I've made today, they're really not based on an identity politics or singling out one particular group. It really is, and this is an approach you may disagree with, it is my view that this is grounded in something larger than that, and it shouldn't turn on those narrow questions. Now, where I do agree with the point that I think we do agree on is it is very important that people understand the reality and diversity of everyone's lives. And that does include lesbians, gay men, non-gay people who care about us, bisexual people, people who are transgender. And as part of the conversation that will move hearts and minds, it is very important that all of us speak up and that our stories be out there and that we understand people's differing experiences in fulfillment of this quest for the common equality that belongs to all of us. And had I taken time in this discussion to tell stories, then, and had I left some of those stories out or somehow left them out, then I think your criticism would have been even more apt. But in terms of the framing of the conversation, those are the reasons that I make the choice I make. If you go to our website, for example, freedomtomarry.org, you will see diverse stories, diverse experiences, diverse injustice that people experience as part of this exclusion from marriage. And that's the way I prefer to frame the point you are making.
I've been curious about, since the passage of Proposition 8, what's going to happen now to all the couples who got married prior to the vote? Because I know the Attorney General of California said that the vote wasn't retroactive, but that's not binding on the state. It's only a matter of time before an employer or something says to a couple, well, your marriage isn't valid, so we're not going to give you spousal benefits.
Right. Well, it's a very good question. The question is, what if Prop 8 were to be upheld by the court on the challenge that's now in front of it, which has to do with the way in which the opponents did not follow the rules for putting this kind of sweep and change into the Constitution? What would happen to the 18,000 couples who've gotten legally married. And as you pointed out, both the governor and the state attorney general have said those marriages are safe and secure. It's a question of whether the right will be denied going forward. That is the right legal answer. I mean, the fact of the matter is these people were legally married by the state of California, and the California can't then unmarry them. It's not like unringing a bell. You can't do that. So that is the correct legal question, but correct legal answer. But as you rightly point out, why should they even have to experience a moment of uncertainty, let alone having to fight to defend their families if they do have to hire lawyers or battle over some opposition or somebody who tries to make life hard for them? And that's one of the many injustices that come with this patchwork of discrimination that our opponents have erected and deepened.
I just had a question, I guess more in your opinion than anything else. Did the Mormon Church think they violated their IRS covenants in pursuing Prop 8?
Right. The question is, did the Mormon Church, which was a huge proponent of the anti-gay measure here and actually funded more than half of it and mobilized forces and were one of the leading, if not the leading force behind the thing, did they violate their tax status? Well, as a lawyer, I have to say I'm not a legal expert in that, and I haven't looked closely at what they actually did. And so I think there actually has been a complaint filed, not about the tax status question so much as did they comply with the California reporting rules, which govern anybody who gets into a political fray and has to conform to certain legal procedures. And there's a challenge that they did not do that they operated behind the scenes and tried to sneak and do things that they weren't supposed to do and didn't report them. And that challenge is in there. On the very general proposition, though, of tax-exempt status, again, without being the definitive legal expert on it, what nonprofits, including churches, are not allowed to do under the tax code is partisan activity, that is to say, endorse a candidate. They're just not allowed to do that. There is, however, leeway for them to get engaged in what's called issue advocacy. And because Prop 8 is not about a candidate, it's not a partisan candidate, it is an issue campaign, they do have leeway to be active. Now, whether they did it properly or not, that remains to be seen. Yeah.
I think a lot that holds LGBT people back from being on board with marriage equality is the fear that somehow marriage will make us buy into a heteronormative society and we'll lose what binds us together as a community. And I don't believe that, but I don't have the arguments to counteract that. So what's your response?
Right. The question is what keeps some people in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities from being fully engaged in the struggle to end marriage discrimination is that somehow it's buying into a heteronormative, as you put it, world, or it's adopting somebody else's view of how people ought to live, and that might undermine the community outlaw status or sense of unity and so on, and what's the answer to that? I have several answers to that. To me, the most important answer is that I don't agree with that because I don't think that's the way life works at all. I mean, for example, when women were admitted to school and allowed to go to schools or to be lawyers, it didn't somehow deprive women of the great distinctiveness of being a woman, which meant that you couldn't go to school or be a lawyer. Instead, it allowed women to fulfill their choices and destinies without arbitrary restriction or exclusion. The vast majority of gay people, and I would actually say the vast majority of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, absolutely want the freedom to marry, and most of them would marry if they could. And they ought to have that choice. And they ought not to have that choice deprived to them because of somebody else's idea of a romantic ideology of apartness or how best to build unity or any other political agenda. We all ought to be free of discrimination from the government and be able to make those choices for ourselves, even if we don't like the choices that the other person makes. That's part of freedom. And in my view, that's what our movement is very much founded on, the notion of choice and freedom and equality. I also don't agree that it would have the effect that some fear. I think that that's just a very kind of essentialized, limited notion of how people shape their lives and how you can be both different and equal. You don't need discrimination and exclusion to have a distinctiveness about your life and about your identity and about your community. I mean, the idea that it was somehow better for Jews or the Irish or African Americans to be excluded and discriminated against because it reinforced solidarity within their communities, I don't think is a view most people would embrace, even if they understand the tensions that are at issue there. And I don't think gay people ought to succumb to that theory either. I'm going to invite all of you who still have questions to meet Evan out at the table in the foyer, because it's 1 o'clock and a number of people have classes. So thank you all for coming.